A very warm welcome to this How To Academy event. My name is Matt Stadler and I'm a presenter on the national radio station LBC, leading Britain's conversation. And this evening, we're kind of leading a global conversation from here in Notting Hill and also with David, who is stateside. And in a moment, if you haven't seen it already, you'll get to understand why lockdown must have been a particular pleasure for him, because he lives in the most extraordinary house. I'm delighted to introduce to you someone you'll probably have come across in many different guises already, including perhaps at the How To Academy, David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist. He's an NYT, New York Times best-selling author. He heads up the Center for Science and Law. He's also an adjunct professor at Stanford. And he's going to tell us all about how your brain works and mine, and perhaps the differences between the two. He's the author of Livewired, and that's why this conversation is called Livewired, the inside story of the ever-changing brain. I found it an absolutely fascinating book. It taught me all sorts of things about myself that I didn't know already, and I can't wait to share a lot of what I've learned over the course of the next hour or so. If you want to join in, as ever, with these virtual events, and of course we prefer to be on stage, and let's hope that we will in the not too distant future. In fact, a journalist friend of mine just tweeted from Bergamo in Italy, which was once upon a time the epicenter, or one of the epicenters of this pandemic, and he was saying it's open and things don't just get worse, they can actually get better. Anyway, we are here and we have to make do with this virtual event, and so you can put your questions to David virtually in the Q&A box, and I'll try to get through as many of those as I can. But David, if you wouldn't mind starting just with a briefish synopsis of why you wrote the book and what's at the heart of it. Very warm welcome to you.
Great, thanks, Matthew. It's terrific to be here. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person this year. I've been to the How To Academy many times, but I'm so pleased that everybody could join today. And speaking of things virtual, this background is virtual. This is not actually my house. I'm actually in my garage, so it's not as great as it appears here. Okay, so here's what I want to talk about is the human brain and what is different about it with other species that are our close cousins, and what that leads to and what this means for our lives. So, okay, let me see if I can get this going. Great. So, maybe some of you have seen a baby zebra get born, or a baby giraffe, or a baby dolphin. And what you'll notice is that within about 45 minutes, these animals are running around. So, a zebra wobbles to its little pencily legs and then it starts running around. And if you've ever seen a Homo sapiens get born, you notice that it doesn't happen that fast. It doesn't take 45 minutes for them to walk. Instead, it takes years. And what this represents is this incredible trick on the part of Mother Nature that she discovered with humans, which is, instead of trying to hardwire everything in at birth, Mother Nature found this simpler and incredibly successful strategy, which is allow neurons to self-modify based on experience. And as a result of this little clever tweak in the genes that led to this strategy, we have taken over every corner of the planet. We've left the planet. We've invented the internet and a million other things because we're this incredibly successful species. Now, this is what's known as brain plasticity, the ability for the brain to reconfigure itself. And the key thing that I argue in the book is that you cannot think about the brain as hardware, and you cannot think about it as software. It's instead what I call liveware. And I prefer this term over the argot of the field, which is brain plasticity, because plasticity was coined by, it's a term that was coined by William James, the great American psychologist, who was impressed by the way that you can mold plastic. And you can take something that's a plastic material and you mold it into a shape, and then it holds that shape. And so what he was indicating was, hey, you can mold a brain into a shape and then it keeps that. And that's great. And that's true. The key is brains are reconfiguring their whole lives. So your entire life, your 86 billion neurons and your trillions of connections are constantly moving and unplugging and replugging and changing. You've got this dynamic living electric fabric that is, constantly reconfiguring itself until the day you die. And that is why I think we need an upgrade from the term plasticity, because given what we are now seeing going on, the word plastic doesn't cut it anymore. And so that's why I've suggested Livewired as the term for this. And so my goal in the book and in this extremely short talk is just to take, sort of the 30,000 papers on brain plasticity and filter them down to what I think are the main principles, the emerging picture that I can see when I squint at everything that's going on. And that's what I'm going to tell you about very briefly, is just a few of them. So I think the first thing for us to really appreciate is that unlike computers, brains are extraordinarily flexible. So I'll give you an example of this. This was a clinical case a few years ago, a 44-year-old man, normal IQ. He went to the doctor because he was having some leg pain. The doctor couldn't figure anything out, so he sent him for a brain scan just to see if they could find anything. And what they found was an enormous surprise, because normally this is a brain scan. This is a slice right down the middle, so you're seeing the side of the brain. And let's see, I don't know if you can see my mouse here. No, but it doesn't matter. The one that's labeled number 3, this is the lateral ventricle. It's a little space in the brain that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Anyway, the reason I'm telling you that detail is because this gentleman's brain scan looked like this. He had what's called hydrocephalus. The fluid was putting too much pressure and it squished his brain up against the sides of his skull. And that's what his brain looked like. And the crazy part is his brain had looked like that his whole life. No one had, ever done a brain scan on him before. But the thing is, he was perfectly normal. He held a perfectly good job. He had a family, all the stuff, even though his brain looked like that. And so this illustrates the remarkable flexibility of this kind of material. And the thing is, you cannot take your cell phone or your laptop and pull half the motherboard out and expect it to still function. But what we have in here, our Livewire, is a completely different kind of beast. And, we're all walking around with this existence proof that this completely futuristic material exists. But we're just scratching the surface in terms of understanding how to build this, how to even understand something like this. And it gets better because a common surgery for children who have epilepsy in an entire hemisphere, half of their brain, is to do a hemispherectomy, where you remove half of the brain. And as long as you do this in a child under about 7 years old, they're perfectly fine. They have no problem with it. They often have a slight limp on the other side because this side of the brain controls the other side of the body. They have a slight limp, but cognitively they're perfectly fine, because all the functions that would have existed on this real estate over here get rewired onto the remaining real estate. And you wouldn't know it if you met a kid who had half of his brain removed. And so there are a number of examples of this sort of thing in the book. And so that's the first thing that I very briefly want to emphasize, is that it's a completely different beast than what we know how to build with our hardware and software layers. Okay, the second thing I want to mention is that brains match themselves to their inputs. So starting in the 1960s, people discovered that there was a map of the body in the brain. So on the left here, on your somatosensory cortex, which is the part of your brain that gets information from the body, you have a map, and areas with higher sensitivity are represented with more real estate. And on the right here, I'm showing the motor cortex, where there's a map of the body. So if you stick an electrode in there at any point and you zap it, I might twitch my finger or move my lip or move my toes or something, depending on where you zap. So people discovered this and they thought, wow, this is terrific. It must be that this is genetically pre-specified, which would be a great guess. But it turns out that's not the answer. And the reason we know that is because if somebody, let's say, loses an arm, the map changes. So the whole question is, how does the brain, which is locked in silence and darkness in the vault of your skull, have any idea what the body looks like? And so I go into that in the book, how the brain figures out what it's controlling, what it's driving. But the point is that when the body plan changes, the brain changes. And the reason I showed a picture of Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson here is because even though he towers over Trafalgar Square, a lot of people never notice that he's actually missing his right arm. And the reason he's missing his right arm is because it was shot off by a musket ball in one of his naval battles. And he experienced phantom pain. He wrote eloquently about what it was like for him to live with one arm. But what we now know is that his brain readjusted when this happened. So this means it is not genetically pre-specified. Instead, the brain figures out whatever body plan it's driving. And I think the way to think about this is, I suggest in the book, the way to think about it is this, as colonization. So as an example, the French grip on the New World, if you look at that through time, they had a big grip on the New World for a while, and then it diminished, and it had everything to do with how many ships they were sending over, because the British and the Spanish were just sending over more ships of people. And as the French over time sent more and fewer people, their grip on the New World waxed and waned. And so this is the same thing when when Lord Nelson sends over fewer ships of data from his missing arm, because it's now missing, it's not sending the ships over, that territory gets taken over, just like it does with any competing territory. Because one of the things to understand about the brain is there's always competition going on between all the areas. Now, what I've shown you so far was just about when someone loses an arm, but this happens with any incoming data. So for example, if you lose your eyes, the part of your brain that we normally think of as the visual cortex becomes no longer visual. So when you look at what's going on in this part of the brain in people who are, let's say, born blind, you find that this part of the brain responds to sound and responds to touch, because nothing lies fallow. It's like if some restaurant went out of business in London, it's not going to just sit there empty for years. It gets taken over by other competitors. And so that's exactly what happens here. And, so as a result, for a blind person, sound and touch move in here, but also memorization of vocabulary words and math problems and so on. And if you actually disrupt the activity there by putting in some magnetic pulses, for example, they get worse at touch and detecting Braille and so on. So we know that that's what's actually going on in that part of the cortex. Now, the really interesting part, one of the really fascinating things for me that's been discovered just in recent years is how unbelievably rapid this takeover of the territory is. So if you blindfold somebody tightly and you stick them in the scanner, what investigators discovered just over a decade ago is that you start seeing activity in their visual cortex in response to touch or sound or things like that. And you see that unbelievably rapidly. Within about an hour, you start getting this encroachment. It's very light at first, but what happens is this takeover from the neighboring senses starts happening rapidly. And the surprise of these findings was their sheer speed. And in the book, we come to understand how that happens and why the brain is so fluid. But I think the key is you can't really think about the brain the way it's typically taught in textbooks, which is, okay, here's the brain, here's this part's for vision, this part's for hearing, touch, and so on. That's only true most of the time based on what's plugged into it. But in fact, the whole thing is a fluid system, and depending on where the data is coming from and what is relevant, it completely changes its distribution of territory. And this speed, by the way, led me and a student of mine in my lab to a completely novel theory about why we dream. And I'll just tell you very briefly, the issue has to do with the rotation of the planet. So what happens is we get cast into darkness for half the time. And of course, I'm talking about during evolutionary timescales, not during current evolutionarily electricity blessed times. So we were cast into darkness, and in the dark, your touch and your hearing and all that stuff works fine, but your vision does not work fine. And so it turns out that when we sleep, your visual system is in danger of getting taken over by hearing and touch. And so the hypothesis is that dreaming is about slamming activity into the visual cortex about every 90 minutes during the night to keep it protected against takeover from neighboring senses. And when you look at the circuitry that underlies dream sleep, it starts in the midbrain and it takes this very specific pathway up and just slams into the visual cortex. And it's just driving activity into there and nowhere else. And so this is what led us to this hypothesis that dreams are the brain's way of fighting takeover from the other senses. And there's much more on this in the book. And if anyone's interested, you could read the scientific paper on this as well. Okay, great. So the next thing of great interest, the next principle for us is how you can actually change what senses are going into the brain, because the brain wraps around whatever senses you feed it. So, so I gave a talk at TED a few years ago on this topic. If you want to watch this online, we built a vest in my lab, and the vest is covered with vibratory motors. And we, for example, for people who are deaf, we capture sound and translate it into patterns of vibration on the skin. And I just realized the audio is not going to work here. But what's happening is I'm actually speaking here, and as I'm speaking, the sound is getting translated into patterns of vibration on the skin from low to high. And you might get a sense of it from here. So on the left, the woman is saying sound, and on the right, she's saying the word touch. And so the motors are mapped from low to high frequency. And as she says sound, it does that. When she says touch, it goes up like that. And this is what's known as sensory substitution, where we can feed data into the brain through an unusual channel, the skin in this case. And the brain, it turns out, does not care how it gets the data as long as the data gets there. Because as I said, the brain is locked in silence and darkness, and it's just trying to figure out what's going on in the outside world. And all the data that comes in is just in the form of electrochemical spikes, just these little spikes in the neurons. And it turns out that you can't tell the difference between spikes that are carrying information about photon capture or air compression waves or pressure and temperature. It all looks exactly the same on the inside of the brain. And so it turns out you can get information in there via different routes. I'll just show you. This is our very first participant who wore the vest. He trained for 4 days. My graduate student, Scott, says a word. He says the word you. And the gentleman on the left, who's completely deaf, feels the pattern vibrations on his vest and is able to translate that into an understanding of what is getting said. So now Scott says the word touch. And Jonathan feels this on the vest, and he's able to translate this. We now shrunk this down to the size of a wristband. I'm just seeing if I have one here. I may not. So, but we have this wristband, and this was our very first prototype wristband here. That's why this looks big and clunky. But the gentleman here is describing what it is like for him to be able to pick up on sound just through patterns of vibration on his skin. And so I ended up spinning off a company from my lab called Neosensory, and we're now on wrists all over the world. And we allow people who are deaf or have high degrees of hearing loss to feel sound on their skin. It gets to their brain that way, and they can operate with that. So, this is just people who are telling us what it's like for them and what they can get and so on. I'll just mention also, I'm a scientific advisor on the show Westworld. And so we put our vest into that show. I don't know if anyone saw, so now I call it Vestworld, by the way. But I don't know if anyone saw, what was this, episode 7 in season 2, but these are our vests here. And so if you look at the guy in the middle here, you can see the vest light up. So what's going on here is he's feeling the location of the robots, the hosts, on his skin. And so he feels spatially, oh, there's one off to the left, there's one on to the right, and so on. And even in the dark and so on, he can dispatch them accordingly. And, you know, like here, for example, they feel that there's a host there and they weren't expecting that and they get killed. And so this just goes to show that if robots go bad, my vest won't help you. But what we were able to do is take this idea and implement it in real life with people who are blind. So in this case, there's LiDAR set up in the offices, and this gentleman who's blind can feel the location of everyone around. He can feel, oh, there's someone up ahead of me on the left, and there's someone approaching me from behind, and so on. He feels what's going on. On top of that, we're adding navigation directions. So even though he's never been here before, he can just follow the buzzing on his vest and navigate accordingly. So there's a lot that we're doing there. Okay, and so yeah, the next principle is that the brain figures out how to control whatever body it's in. So not just inputs, but outputs. So for example, I mentioned this thing about the map of the body and the brain and how it had been assumed at one point that maybe you're just born with that. We're getting a lot more insight nowadays into how flexible the map of the body is and what it can drive. And so one example that I use in the book is about this dog named Faith, who was born without front legs. And so she needed to get to food and water and her mother and so on. And so she just figured out how to walk on her back legs. It's actually not that hard. You've probably not seen dogs do this before. Why? Because dogs don't need to walk on their back legs. They don't have it. It's not relevant for them. And so they don't do it. But it turns out it's not that hard for a dog to figure this out. And so what this demonstrates is the dog brain does not drop into the world expecting to drive a dog body. Instead, it drives whatever it finds, whatever it discovers it is inside of. And we find all kinds of examples like this. One that I use in the book is this guy who's the world's best archer. He's got the world record for the longest accurate shot. He has no arms. And so he shoots with his feet. Why? Because it was relevant to him and he wanted to figure out how to do it. And so he was easily able to do it. This is actually from my show, The Brain. This is a woman who's paralyzed completely. And so she got this brain implant in her motor cortex that allows her to control a very beautiful robotic arm across the room. So she's controlling this with her thoughts by thinking about, moving her own arm, which of course can't move because the spinal cord is damaged. So the signals are not getting through there. But so she just thinks about this and controls the arm this way. And she's gotten better and better, in part because the engineers have tweaked the algorithm, but in large part it's because her brain has figured out exactly how to drive this arm because it's plastic and able to do so. And one of the things worth noting is that we're just starting to scratch the surface of this in terms of how to build a completely new, how to rethink robotics in a completely different way. So I'll just give you an example. This is from my colleague Hod Lipson. The idea is you build a robot, this is called the Starfish, and the robot is not pre-programmed to know what its body is. In fact, it's not programmed at all to know what its body is. And it experiments to figure it out. It puts out actions. It feels what happens in terms of its balance and so on. And it figures out how to walk that way. It figures out how to move itself. And then one of the things that you can do is, knock a leg off of it or something, and it'll figure out how to operate with its new body plan. And that's what humans are so good at doing. We operate with new body plans all the time, as in you get on a bicycle or a surfboard or a skateboard or whatever. And, your evolution didn't foresee wheels coming for a bicycle, but it has no problem just figuring that out and then incorporating that into the resume of what you can do. Okay, so, all right, last principle I'll mention is that all these principles, which I've, worked to distill into the book and tell them around stories and so on, we can leverage this to build new kinds of devices. So just as an example, I was watching carefully, what happened when we got the Mars rover Spirit to the red planet. And of course it was so exciting and it did a great job. And it was a multi-billion-dollar project. But what happened, as you may know, is it got its right front wheel caught in stuck in the Martian soil, and it died. And if you compare that to, let's say, a wolf who gets its leg caught in a trap you may know what the wolf does is it'll chew its leg off, and then it figures out how to walk on 3 legs. It was not genetically pre-programmed to walk on 3 legs, but it just figures it out through a series of feedback and relevance and so on. And so wouldn't it be great if we could build robots like Spirit that could say, oh, geez, I'm stuck. I'm going to chew my wheel off and then figure out how to operate this body plan differently. So the wolf carries on with the limp because animals don't shut down with moderate damage, and neither should our machines. So in the last part of the book, I talk about what I see as the biological future of machines. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say by way of introduction. And at this point, I'd love to, Matthew, chat with you.
You reintroduced me. It's fascinating stuff. There's so many different jumping off points. I've got about a squillion questions. My first is, how much do you think we understand about our brains now?
It's impossible to put a number on it because you would have to know what the 100% mark is to even say how much we know. But clearly we know very little. I mean, we're just at the foot of the mountain. And that's because what we're talking about is unrivaled in terms of its complexity, in terms of anything we've ever discovered. As I mentioned earlier, there's 86 billion neurons. Every neuron in your head is about as complicated as the city of London. It has the entire human genome in it. It's trafficking millions of proteins around in very complicated biochemical cascades. And each one of these is interacting with about 10,000 of its neighbors over this, 0.2 quadrillion connections. So this kind of thing bankrupts our language and totally boggles the mind, a system of that kind of complexity. And all we have riding on top of that is just our consciousness, where we think, oh, I'm hungry, I'm sleepy, whatever the thing is. But there's an enormous amount happening under the hood. And so we know very little. And by the way, in 2006, actually, I wrote the cover article in Discover magazine called 10 Unsolved Mysteries of the Brain. And the reason I mentioned the year is because when I look back in 2020, we have made no progress on any of those big questions. Questions like consciousness, how do you ever build a machine out of physical pieces and parts and get consciousness out of it? Have it, feel private, subjective, internal experience.
It's a supreme irony that our minds are boggled by our own minds. I mean, you mentioned consciousness. How do you understand consciousness in its most basic form?
Yeah, it's the thing that flickers to life when you wake up in the morning, if you meant what is the definition of it, but how to understand it. Not only do we not have a good theory about it, we don't even know what such a theory would look like, because there's no way to take the tools of science that we have and say, okay, look, just carry the 2 and do a triple integral here. And that is the taste of feta cheese, or the smell of cinnamon, or the pain of pain, or the redness of red. I mean, there's no way to even quite see how to take our current tools and translate it into private subjective experience.
Yeah, because you mentioned in the book that you've done experiments with colors. How do we know that when I'm looking at blue, you're seeing the same color as I am?
Yeah, we have no way of knowing that. And and of course it doesn't matter as long as you and I can both call something blue, because our mothers taught us to call that blue. It doesn't matter if what you call it is what I see is red on the inside, because we can transact and negotiate in the outside world. And I think it might even be far worse than that. I mean, what you call vision and what I call vision might be very different, and yours might be upside down from mine or something, and it wouldn't matter as long as we can transact and negotiate in the outside world. What I find interesting is this issue about, can we create new senses for humans? If anyone's interested in this is you can just find my TED Talk online where I go into more depth on this, but like with the vest or with the wristband, can we create new senses for humans? The interesting part is that if we did that, we wouldn't really be able to communicate it to other people. So let's say, Matthew, that you wear a vest that communicates stock market data. So you start having an internal subjective experience of the economic movements of the planet. And I'm wearing a wristband that tells me infrared light. And so I start having a direct perceptual sense of the infrared light that's around me, which is normally invisible. The thing is, we couldn't communicate that to each other because language is all about shared notions. And it's impossible to imagine what another sense would feel like. In the same way, if I asked you, imagine a new color. So, take a moment, think about imagining a new color. It's impossible to do. And what this illustrates is the fence line of our internal experience. We cannot ever imagine something that's outside of the experience we've already had. So it may be that we end up, having to invent new words for these things, and only other people that are wearing this would ever even have an understanding of it.
Given that our brains, as you explain, are changing and adapting the whole time, what are the implications of that for identity?
Yeah, this is something I wrote a lot about in my book, Some, which is a book of fiction. But one of the things that I love to explore is this issue of how we change through time without really realizing that we're changing. So in one of the stories, in the afterlife, you're split into all of your ages. And so, the expectation is that it'll be really wonderful to hang out with all your different ages. But it turns out the 7-year-old you kind of likes hanging out with other 7-year-olds, and the 65-year-old you really wants to just hang out with other colleagues instead of. And so once a year, all of the different yous, the different ages of you get together for like a family reunion. But you're not really the same person at all through life. And because we have the same sort of history and resume, you kind of think that you're the same person. But because the brain is constantly changing with every new experience you have, you drift, you change through life by quite a bit. So I think these things are really interesting in terms of thinking about our identity.
But it also has possible implications for accountability, even for criminal responsibility, because if we're fundamentally different beings or characters to where we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, for how long should we continue to be punished?
Yeah, the interesting part is, people go off on different trajectories depending on, for better or worse, their childhood experiences. I mean, from the moment they drop out of the womb, people end up going off on different pathways. And it is often the case that somebody who's going on a particular pathway stays generally in that range. So if they committed this crime 3 years ago, they may still, whatever was worrisome about their character that did it at the time, they may still have that quality. But I deal a lot with the criminal justice system. I actually am the director of the Center for Science and Law. And all the time, I know several people in prison who have exactly the situation that you've described, which is they committed a crime, let's say 30 years ago, and they're clearly different now. They're clearly not the same person. And they, just as one example, a lot of times with sex crimes, as a brain just simply ages, it becomes very different and is not as driven as it was and so on. Anyway, this is something that the legal system always has to deal with. It tends not to incorporate neuroscience too deeply into it at the moment, but I'm trying to change that.
It's impossible, as you said a little earlier, to know how much we don't know about the brain. Is it impossible, in a similar sense, to know how much of you, David, is nature and how much of it is nurture?
Yeah, it turns out the nature versus nurture question is actually a dead question in biology now, because it is always both. So, you drop into the world with a certain set of genes, and that prescribes, the borders of what can happen. And then from there, your experiences lead you off on very different pathways. But there's all this feedback, by which I mean, there's a whole field called epigenetics now, which is how your experiences will end up feeding back all the way to your genome and causing some genes to express more and express less and change the configuration of the genome. And so your experiences actually change what is getting expressed. And so these things are tied too tightly together to ever separate them. And this is one of the themes of the book also, is that when you look at something like artificial intelligence, which is all the rage here in Silicon Valley where I live, what it's doing is it's taking a very sort of simplified notion of neuroscience, which is, okay, you've got these units that are connected with each other, and then it goes off in its own direction. And it's done some incredibly impressive stuff, but it's actually nothing like the brain. I mean, the brain does incredibly impressive stuff that's quite different, as in a 3-year-old child can walk into a room and navigate the room and get food to her mouth and manipulate adults and do all kinds of things that computers can't do any of that stuff well, not even close. And so, plus humans have generalized intelligence, which means we can do many things. Whereas with an artificial neural network, it can discriminate pictures of dogs and cats with superhuman skill. But if you then ask it to do something else, like distinguish pictures of, camels and bears, it fails catastrophically. So anyway, part of what this has to do with is in an artificial neural network, you're just changing the connection strength between neurons. But in real brains, you have changes not only at the connection points, but all the way down, the receptors that are expressed in the cell, the biochemical cascades, all the way down to the genome. So
you've talked several times already about the idea of dropping into the world. So if I were to be dropped into the caveman era, as you mentioned in the book, how different would I have been?
Yeah, it's funny, right? The question that I posed is, what if you were born with exactly your genome, exactly you come out of the womb and you find yourself, 30,000 years ago instead of now. I think you'd be an extremely different person, because it's all about experience. What is the experience that you have? That's what molds and shapes your brain. And so anything we think about that, like, oh, I'd probably be silly. I'd be like me, but running around in a pelt around the campfire. Probably not the case, because experience is so important. And by the way, we see this all the time with nature's tragic experiments with, kids who are severely neglected, or I didn't talk about this in the book, but I did talk about this in my show, The Brain, about the Romanian orphanages, which after the fall of Ceausescu ended up with tens of thousands of kids whose parents had been killed. And there were too many kids. And so the staff decided, okay, look, the only way we're going to be able to do this is if we don't talk to the kids and we don't pick up the kids and cuddle them and so on, because otherwise they'll become too clingy. And so they just didn't interact with the kids. And all these kids ended up with severe cognitive deficits, because what Mother Nature is doing is actually a bit of a gamble, which is, I'm going to drop a brain into the world half baked, and I'm going to assume that the conditions of the world are enough to form the brain appropriately. But if you're not getting the right input, then the brain doesn't develop correctly.
In the book, you describe the very difficult, challenging story of the little boy, Matthew, who has half of his brain removed. You spoke in your little presentation about what can happen when half your brain is removed. And he ended up developing into a normal human being. He works in a restaurant. He's able to do much the same as all the rest of us are capable of doing, if not exactly the same things. But then you give a very sad example of a little girl who was found after, I think, the first 7 years or so of her life. And she'd been trapped in a cellar with no human interaction, or almost no human interaction at all. And her development subsequent to that was far more difficult.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, she can't speak language. She can't see more than 13 feet. She can't chew solid food. And, even after years and years of training and all these, psychologists and people and everybody's caring for her, she still hasn't gotten language, because the brain has these closing doors, these critical windows that you need to learn things like language within, or else it becomes too late. And so, you can do just fine if you're getting love with half a brain, but you can't do well if you have a full brain but are not getting the things that a child needs in order to develop correctly.
Just to follow up briefly on this nature, nurture plus consciousness and accountability theme before moving on. If we are no more than the sum of our nature and our nurture, can we be properly accountable for anything? I mean, to what extent are we autonomous? If we're being shaped by our genetics and also by our environments, where does sort of free will fit into that?
Yeah, this is one of the big questions in neuroscience is, do we have free will? Because when we look at the brain, it is vastly complex, as I mentioned, but it is fundamentally a machine. It's a biological machine where every neuron is getting driven by the activity of other neurons. And it's not clear where you get sort of a puff of this extra bit in there that causes what would be free will, as opposed to it being a machine. So this is a very tough question. As it turns out, from the legal system point of view, it actually makes no difference whether people had the free will or didn't have the free will, because you still have to take someone who's acting aggressive and violent and so on and take them off the streets to protect everyone else. So, but the key thing with the legal system is to figure out how to best manage things moving forward. So instead of imagining that incarceration is the one size fits all solution, one of the things that we're able to do is say, hey, you have a drug addiction problem. Here's a way we can help you, instead of imagining that jail is going to help. Oh, you have a mental illness. In the United States, it's estimated that 30% of the prison population has mental illness. Having them break rocks in the sun doesn't help schizophrenia. So you need to have clever ways of doing things and finding treatment for people. But it doesn't change the fact that if they've committed a crime, you still have to take them off the street.
Tell us, as you do in the book, a little bit more about, and it's an important theme, the different speeds of learning.
Yeah. So this is the thing. We, as I mentioned when I was talking about artificial neural networks, the reason artificial neural networks look just at the synaptic connection strength, and we tend to do that in neuroscience also, we just concentrate on that, is because that's what we can most easily measure. And so what I suggest in the book is it's like the drunk looking for the keys under the street light, because that's where the light is best. But the fact is, we know that all these parameters all the way down are changing. And so you get all kinds of weird and interesting properties out of that. And I'm able to, explain how these things come about. I'll give you one example, which is there's something called Ribot's law, which is the oldest principle in neurology, actually, which is that older memories are more stable than newer memories, which is very weird, right? Because institutions don't work that way. They don't remember their older stuff better than their newer stuff, but human brains do. And so if any of you know, maybe you've known an older person who's getting dementia, they can't remember what they did in the last week or last month or last year, but they remember their childhoods just fine. And in fact, one of the stories I tell is about Albert Einstein, who nobody knows his last words, because on his deathbed, he was speaking in German, his original language, and the night nurse didn't speak German, so we don't know what his last words were. But this is quite common, where people revert to their original language as they're getting very old and they're on their deathbed. And so what this demonstrates is that, human memory, the way we talk about it, is not like memory in a computer or in an artificial neural network, but instead it has to do with learning, getting pushed all the way down different levels, different, speeds of change all the way down. And so what I compare it to is, in a city, you have all kinds of different speeds of change. So if you look at a city over time, their fashion is changing rapidly, and then commerce and the stores that are there is changing more slowly, and then governance, how you pass laws for the city, is changing even more slowly, and the architecture is changing even more slowly, and all the way down to nature. And it's sort of the same kind of thing that you can do in the brain, where you have some parts that are changing really fast and some parts that are changing slow, and it's all about the interaction of these that matters.
So with memory, when there are things that we know have happened to us, but we can't remember, but want to remember, what's going on there? Are they somewhere buried deep in our brain? Do they exist there? If you got your torch out and you were a very, very clever neuroscientist, would you be able to locate those for me?
Yeah, it's probably not, in the sense that what happens as things get deeper and deeper is there's some amount of abstraction that goes on, which is, okay, I remember that this person I really like, and this person over here I really am suspicious about, but you don't, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you can't really remember the details? Like, I met that person years ago. I don't remember why I like that person so much, or why I feel that person's creepy or whatever, but it's because you've abstracted away the details, because for almost all of us, we can't possibly remember all those details. The reason I say almost all of us is there are people with essentially perfect memories. They're called mnemonists, and they have what's called hyperthymesia, which is they encode everything, but it's a very unusual state. And by the way, they're not particularly happy about it. As an Indian philosopher once said, memories beautify life, but only forgetting makes it bearable.
So what's happening with this memory, or this perception of memory that I have? This is the weekend of the Notting Hill Carnival. I'm in Notting Hill. Normally, if it were not a pandemic, there'd be 1 million or 2 million people on the streets. Unfortunately, one or two of them might be urinating on my front yard, but it's basically a celebration of West Indian culture, and it's great fun, and I love it. Now, I can remember, I've been going for decades, and I can remember, or believe I can remember, going on my father's shoulders when I was 2 years old. Is that a real memory, or is that a memory of a memory? To what extent are memories memories of memories?
Yeah, I mean, memory is a myth-making machine, and we're constantly reinventing our past to make it consistent with who we think we are. The general story is that boys don't lay down memory till about 3.5. Girls at about 3 is when your first real memory is. But when I say real memory, even that is suspect. I mean, memories drift. And by the way, a colleague of mine did a great study right after September 11th, 2001. She interviewed a number of people in Midtown and downtown New York. In other words, those who'd been right there and those who'd been a little distance away. But anyway, she asked people about their memories in great detail about September 11th that morning. And then she also asked them to tell some memory from September 10th, just some banal thing about what they ate for breakfast and blah, blah. And then she tracked them down a year later and asked them about both types of memory. And it turns out both memories had drifted completely. So even, what we call amygdala memory that's emotionally valenced, doesn't matter. Everything drifts. We're constantly, we're storytellers.
But if you look at the Tyrone Iceman who pops up in the book, your belief or your hunch is that we might be able to return to this Tyrone Iceman in the future, and by studying the brain, actually paint a picture for ourselves of what his life was like.
Yeah, exactly. So the argument I make there is, everything that happens to you is stored in the structure of your brain. I mean, that's what it means to experience the smell of something, or recognize somebody, or have a memory, as true or false as that memory is. And so if we could take an ancient brain and actually, this is not going to happen in our lifetimes, but actually learn how to decode the structure of this massive machinery, we could, in theory, know what it was like to be the Tyrone Iceman. And again, this is not to say that the memories would be accurate, but nonetheless, the smells, the sights, the memories that he had, irrespective of their accuracy and so on, we'd be able to read that out. One of my mentors was the great Brit Francis Crick, and when he died in 2006, he was cremated, and I thought, God, what a waste. Like he was probably the greatest brain of 20th century biology. And then it just gets burned up. And I thought, damn it, if we could have just somehow had the technology to retain that, so that 100 years from now, when we're able to read that out, we could say, hey, Francis, what do you think of this and that?
Now, our brains have to simplify things, as you've already intimated, in order for us to be able to function properly. And one of the ways, as I understand it or experience it, that the brain simplifies things is through language. So when we're reading a word, we're looking at symbols, but very, very quickly, instantly almost, we're computing meaning from them. If I look at a language that is foreign to me, a 10-letter word could take a second or two to compute, even visually. Whereas if it were a 10-letter word in English, it would happen just like that. So what's going on there?
Yeah, it turns out what we do is we change our own circuitry to automatize the tasks that are important to us. So for you, reading English is really important. So from the time you were a child, you've been drilling that into your head. So now what you have is all this circuitry that is specialized for reading the English language. If you grew up in China, you'd have different specialized circuitry just for reading that sort of language. And when things become, they sort of get part of the circuitry, the hardware of the brain, they become fast and effortless and use very little energy. And so this is the game that the brain is always playing, is how can I take the things that are in my environment that I need to figure out and make it so that it becomes part of the machinery and I don't have to put much effort into that. And actually, let me just say one tangential thing about this, which is, despite how awful this coronavirus lockdown is for everybody, I think the one good silver lining that comes out of this has to do with brain plasticity, which is to say we have grown up and we've spent our whole lives optimizing our brains to operate in this world as we know it. And suddenly, all of us are kicked off of our path of least resistance. We're all off of the hamster wheel that we're used to. And we're having to be very creative and think of things afresh. And, there's plenty of stress and anxiety that goes with this. But boy, I think that is one of the best things that can happen for the brain, is being forced to rethink everything and build new bridges.
How fundamentally and how quickly can we change when we're in our 40s, 50s, 30s, once we feel that we're pretty much fully developed? I mean, I imagine neuroscientists are fascinated by how we're reacting and responding to this pandemic.
Exactly right. Look, one of the things that I suggest in the book is that, so we know plasticity diminishes with age, but part of that has to do with motivation, which is to say, as we get into our 40s and we have a really good model of the world and we can optimize our functioning and say, wow, I really got this. I've got my job. I go to the lab. I go to my company. This is cool. There's less and less relevance to changing that internal model. There's no motivation for it. But if we are challenged and we have to change our internal model, we are able to. I mean, there's adult plasticity. The brain can change in an adult pretty easily. It's just that most of us never have that opportunity to try. But one of the things that you find is that, when people retire, for example, their lives tend to shrink and dementia sets in. But there's been a multi-decade study going on about people who have been cognitively active their whole lives up to the day they die. They have all kinds of challenges and things they have to do. So some of them, it turns out, have Alzheimer's disease and their brain is physically degenerating. But even as their brain is degenerating, they're constantly building new roadways because of challenging themselves.
To what extent is it true that we can train the brain as a muscle, so that by continuing to be cognitively active, as you describe, we're actually retaining more of our brain function?
Yes. I mean, that is probably the most important lesson from modern neuroscience, is the critical nature of doing that, which is to say, keeping your brain challenged all the time. This is true for us, but it's especially true as people get older and older. And what that means is seeking novel challenges, things that are frustrating but achievable in that range. As soon as you get good at something like Sudoku or whatever, drop that and pick up the next thing that you're no good at. That's the key, is to constantly challenge the brain.
This isn't entirely unrelated to the reading of the language question, but when we talk of muscle memory, so if you learn a martial art or if you're a concert pianist, I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it, the extent to which a concert pianist can play at a ferocious pace. And you think the mind can't actively, surely, be triggering all those different finger movements. What's going on there, to put it simply?
Yeah, well, it's not actually muscle memory, even though we call it that. It's all in the brain. It's all about the brain reconfiguring its circuitry to say, okay, Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, bang, here it is. It's getting burned all the way down to the circuitry. And so for the pianist first learning how to play the Rock 3, it is unbelievably challenging and takes a lot of cognitive effort. But after one becomes, Helfgott or, Ashkenazi, you just, to call it muscle memory simply means it's burned into the circuitry. So your conscious mind is no longer involved in it at all. It's just part of your operating system now.
I want you to tell us a little bit more about sleep and what's going on with our brains at that point. You talked earlier about consciousness bubbling up as we wake up, but REM sleep has a very important function, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so this I mentioned in the talk. I think my hypothesis, which I think is true now, we've published on this, is that REM dream sleep is all about just keeping the cortex active against invasion by neighbors. And generally, sleep has lots of functions. Deep sleep, which is different than dream sleep, deep sleep has functions in terms of taking out the neural trash and consolidating things that were learned during the day and so on. There's a lot of study on this currently. There's sort of, many different functions of sleep that all seem to be true at the same time.
But building on this, though, there's a lot of competition going on inside our brains, isn't there? And I wonder how the brain prioritizes on our behalf the things that we really need to be doing.
Yeah, it doesn't do any prioritization. It has everything to do with the data that comes in, So just as an example, if I were to anesthetize my arm, like let's say I put in a clamp really tightly, so I inject it with an anesthetic, my brain maps will start to change because it says, oh, I'm simply not getting enough data from the arm. Or if I even tie two fingers together, so instead of acting as two independent fingers, it's like one unit now, my brain maps will actually change. So it's all about what's coming in. And as far as other stuff, it's all about what is relevant, what you get good feedback on. So in the book, I propose, what if there were a fictional brother to Venus and Serena Williams named Fred Williams, and he did just as much tennis practice as they did, but for whatever reason, he didn't like it. He didn't get the positive feedback from relatives and friends and whatever, and he wasn't motivated to do tennis and whatever. What would happen to his brain? And the answer is his brain would not change in the same way Venus and Serena's brains would be changing. And the reason is you need the positive feedback as a way of changing the distribution of territory.
But explain then what's happening if it's not about prioritization. When I'm speaking to you and we've got hundreds of people listening and watching, so that's kind of important. You've definitely got my attention. I'm very focused on this conversation. But if over the rim of my laptop I would see a lion rear its head outside my window, unlikely though that might be, I think I might become distracted from our conversation. So what happens there in terms of prioritization?
Well, great. What you're talking about is the attentional system, and you've got these very deep systems. We'd summarize it as the limbic system, that is all about, is there an emergency thing going on? And that, you're constantly allocating your attention based on priorities. And so that's not so much a brain plasticity issue as a very deeply wired fundamental thing about, oh, I'm in danger, and all your attention goes there.
But isn't it interesting though, David, that given the sophistication of our brains, so sophisticated that even our own brains don't understand how much more there is to understand about them, it's a sort of paradox. Yet at the same time, we as human beings are notorious for being very, very poorly equipped to deal with more than two kind of big thoughts or big ideas or big attention grabbers at the same time. So at the moment, we're absolutely focused on the pandemic, and yet climate change is roaring up on the horizon. So why are we so simplistic and yet so complex at the same time?
This has to do with the funnel of consciousness. So you've got this entire cosmos going on inside your head, but your consciousness has a very low bandwidth. And so it can only think essentially one thought at a time. And fundamentally, we are creatures that have grown up in small groups, and we have very basic sorts of needs and wants and desires. And so what you care about is, what's my next meal? Who's my mate? What's going on with, the next thing? And so, bigger issues going on in the world are hard to hold on to and stay invested in, because you've got other more local needs going on, because that's just the kind of creatures that we are.
I've got to prioritize the questions that I ask you, because we haven't got a huge amount of time left, and I want to bring in some Q&A questions as well.
Okay.
But describe to us briefly, if you would, in the most broad sense, the power of the mind over the body. The mind can play tricks on us, as you say, but when we can go as far as, say, to imagine symptoms of physical illness, or we can, correct me if I'm wrong, or we can manifest physical signs of distress as a result of what's going on in our brain.
Yeah, the brain and the body, of course, are tied very tightly together. And some people even point to, is the gut involved in how we think and so on. The general story on this is that the brain is the densest representation of who you are. It's like the metropolitan center, and the body is, let's say, the greater metropolitan area. But there's plenty of interaction and communication between those. And so it's no surprise that we show all kinds of physical symptoms with things. As far as the power of the mind over the body, that is unfortunately limited. I mean, if you get skin cancer in your leg, you're not going to be able to think your way out of that one. It's just, unfortunately, there's so much in biology that our minds can't accomplish that way.
So when we typically hear about people fighting or struggling against cancer or another disease, Is that unfair? I mean, often people who suffer from those diseases themselves talk about the fight that they're engaged with, but can the mind help us to get better? I mean, you can't wish away cancer, but can you fight it?
Yeah, unfortunately, it does not seem so. I mean, every single person who's had cancer has died, as has everybody. What I mean is even the most optimistic Buddhist monk or whatever, everybody dies. And so that tells us that it's not something that you can just use the mind to override the body on that stuff. When people talk about struggling with cancer and struggling against it, I think mostly what they're talking about is a psychological thing. Like, how do I put aside my grief, and how do I communicate with my family well, and how do I stay optimistic about things? But they're not actually fighting the cancer itself. They're fighting all the psychological warfare around it.
Final quick question for me before the Q&A. How do you see Gertrude the pig and the future? Do you believe that we will get to a point where we start inserting chips into our brains so that we can turn the telly on and off?
You're referring to the Neuralink presentation the other day?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, Elon Musk's new company is Neuralink, where they drill a hole in the head and they insert electrodes. What's just a 1 second thing on that, inserting electrodes into the brain to be able to measure from neurons. There's nothing new about that. That's been happening for at least 50 or 60 years. But but what he and his team have developed is a way of sort of sewing electrodes in there so you get a higher density. So they can read, let's say, 1,000 different neurons activity without hitting any blood vessels. It's quite cool. But it's just a different degree of what we've been doing. But the question is, will consumers go for that? That was sort of always the shtick around Neuralink is, wow, everybody will get that. Here's what I think in one sentence, which is that it's going to be very useful for clinical states, as in, with major depression or Parkinson's or epilepsy. And, this idea of just getting a better density of electrodes in there. Will it ever get to the point where consumers use it to interact with their phone faster? I doubt it. And here's why. It's because it's an open head surgery, and surgeons aren't going to do it because there's always risk of infection and death on the table. And it's just not worth the risk in order to be able to interact better with your computer.
Joel wants to ask you, David, says, my stepfather is 88, has taken on lots of new habits and interests around poetry and literature after my mother's death. And he said he thought that his brain had changed. Is this possible so late in life? It plays back into a question earlier on in our conversation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's adult plasticity. And if you're challenging yourself, like really appropriately challenging yourself, again, as soon as you get good at something, dropping that, picking out something that you're no good at, then yes, that is exactly what happens.
How do we, says Marek, how do we reconcile the amazing examples of plasticity with the failure of the brain to recover from, for example, a hard blow to the head?
Yeah. One of the studies that I talk about in the book is after World War II, there were a number of people with head injuries. And so a scientist in the 70s tracked down a whole bunch of these soldiers who had now grown up to see how they were faring. And what he found pretty clearly was that the younger you are when you get the head injury, the better off you are. The older a brain gets, the less flexible it is. And it's for this reason that I mentioned before, which is that you've been learning the world. And as you've been learning the world, you've cemented more and more tightly into place. And so then when something gets damaged, it's harder to find room to move around. But the younger you are, the more room you have to do that.
And Michelle says, when you spoke about why we dream, does that mean that the people who have permanently lost their vision do not dream? And that's not an entirely different question to Jill's, who says, does a blind person dream in images? If we dream,
it's a great question.
If we dream to keep the visual cortex.
I got it. It's a great question. And the thing is that blind people do dream, but it's not visual. What they dream about is, I was walking around in my living room and someone had moved the couch, and then there was this bizarre creature over in the corner that I was feeling, and so on. So they have dreams because they still have the circuitry. It's a very evolutionarily old thing that we have that drives activity into the occipital cortex. So as shorthand, I was just calling it the visual cortex. But as I mentioned at the beginning, for a blind person, it's not the visual cortex. It's just the occipital lobe here. Activity gets driven into there. But for a blind person, that involves touch and feel and hearing and so on. And so that's what they dream about.
Anna wants to know whether you've done any research on the brain reaction to COVID or post-COVID loss of smell and taste.
No, I'm keeping my eye on that like everyone is. It's an emerging field on that.
Joel says, if brain transplants were possible, how would a brain adapt to a new body?
Amazingly, I think it would adapt so fast because, I mean, just look at when somebody climbs into one of those big mech suits where you can control, you know, a 12-foot tall robot, or just control a crane or control whatever. Brains are just so good at saying, oh, I get it. I've got a different body now. You know, it just doesn't take that long. The interesting part, if you could actually do a brain transplant, is that it might be that there's different chemicals in terms of the adrenal gland and other hormones and so on coursing around, so that your cognition might be a little bit different. It would be like as if you just drunk a beer or something, and you're just slightly, you know, you're 3% different than you were because of the different chemicals coursing around from the other person's body.
Just in synthesis, explain this part in the book where you talk about live wired devices and why we haven't built them yet.
Oh, yeah. The reason we haven't built them yet is because we're just starting to scratch the surface. And what I'm hoping is that this book is the launching pad for really understanding what are the principles that the brain is actually doing, and therefore how could we build machines to do this. You know, I make a bunch of suggestions about, you know, hooking up the International Space Station so that when you plug in a new module, it just figures out what to do with its new body and how to use its new sensors and so on, all the way to, could you build a building where it dynamically changes things like, oh, I see the kitchen's getting used a lot, so I'm going to make the kitchen space bigger. And, oh, these bathrooms are getting used a lot. There's a lot of traffic, so I'm going to grow more toilets and grow the piping and the wiring in there and so on. That's what bodies do. And the question is, why can't we build, you know, buildings to do that as well?
Couple of questions. By the way, it's brilliant how concise you are in your answers when we're talking about such complicated things. It's like my friend who emailed earlier who said she won a prize with her book club for describing one of your books. I think it was some, actually. And the reason she thinks you were so brilliant is because you're able to explain things in ways that people who might not normally be able to understand them can understand them. And I include myself in that. Layla and Karen both have questions about cancer. Layla says, can the brain detect cancer cells? And if so, why can't it help cure it? And Karen says, David, considering the connection between the brain and the body, do you think there would be a way to get the brain to focus on an area of the body to prevent future cancer in it, or heal early cancer, for example, breast cancer?
This is closely related to what I answered before. And I wish I had something more optimistic to say about this, but people have been trying this eagerly for hundreds or thousands of years. And I don't think there's that much success with that. You know, when Steve Jobs got cancer, he went and he tried all kinds of things like this. And of course, every, you know, spiritual leaders and so on, they've all done this kind of thing, but there doesn't appear to be a way, at least that we know about yet. In contrast, there are pharmaceutical drugs that just take care of things. I mean, you know, this is true with anything we look at, for better or worse. You know, take something like depression. You know, there's no, people used to, take something like schizophrenia, actually. People used to think the person was possessed by the devil and beat them and put them in jail and stuff like that. And that doesn't actually work, but a little pill works wonders for clearing that up. And then the person doesn't have schizophrenia anymore. So these are the reasons why we have turned increasingly to a biological understanding of the brain, because we realize, wow, you just change this or that, and suddenly that's gone. So I think the same thing applies here.
Katrina asks, can you say something about the 60% brain shrinkage during sleep?
The what, 60% brain shrinkage?
60% brain shrinkage during sleep. I have no idea whether that's true or not.
Yeah, I've not heard of that.
Lynn asks, so one of the takeaways for me from this is that activity within an hour can change the somatosensory cortex. Can yoga have an impact on the somatosensory cortex, and how?
Yeah, now the data I cited about the change in an hour was about the visual cortex, not somatosensory, but generally the somatosensory cortex is very flexible, because as you know, first of all, as you grow from an infant to an adult, your body completely changes. When you get on different devices, it changes. You know, as I said, if you break your pinky or whatever, things change. So it is all very flexible. Can yoga change it? I mean, certainly that changes your motor cortex and your ability to balance on your head and so on. You learn how to do things with your body that you didn't know otherwise. But that what I'm answering might be obvious. And so I don't have anything beyond that to say.
Just going to hurtle through one or two more questions. Do brains get better at anything with age?
Yeah, what they're very good at doing is predicting the future better, because when you're a child, everything's new and you're able to pick up new languages rapidly and so on, but you don't really have a good model of the world. And so as you get older, you've seen things before, you've seen patterns, you've met personality types, you've kind of gotten it. So little surprises you, and that is both good and bad. But the good part of it is the reason it doesn't surprise you is because you have a pretty broad model of what's happening now. So that's what brains get better at.
Juliet asked, with the idea of neuroplasticity, can you rewire your brain to overcome unhelpful beliefs input during childhood?
It's challenging, and it's because this stuff goes deep. The stuff that happens to you during childhood goes very deep, but we've probably all had the experience of sometimes accidentally or otherwise reframing something and realizing something about, oh, I don't know, let's say somebody in your childhood who treated you badly and whatever. And then you learn something later in life, like, oh, that person had this terrible problem going on and we didn't realize it. And then it's sort of a breakthrough, because at this very deep level, you're understanding that your whole model upon which you've built lots of other stuff, there's something at the bottom of the model that's not right anymore. You pull the rug out from under that and you have a chance to reconstruct a bunch of things. So it is possible to change our minds on stuff. It's just, it's harder and harder the deeper that stuff goes.
We've touched, of course, in different ways on personality, but Marta says, where does personality fit into this? And is that static or amenable to change?
It's both amenable to change, and it is something that changes. I mean, if you've ever had the experience of finding a diary entry that you wrote 20 years ago and you think, God, how did I do that? Like, I was such a different person. Yeah, personality changes. You know, again, I would say it's within a particular a cone. So you can change within a certain cone. You can't probably become a completely different person, but there's definitely drift.
A question for me before we end. See, what I'm sort of struggling to understand is the extent to which we can interfere physically with our brains in order to change things, enhance things, diminish things. So could you work out which part of my brain is responsibility for a particular personality trait and get in there with equipment, medical equipment, and change it and tweak it?
We can't now, and probably not for the foreseeable future. And it's because something about your personality is not in any particular area. The analogy that I used in my show, The Brain, is that, imagine I looked at the city of London and I said, okay, where exactly is the economy of London? There isn't a single spot. It's all about the interaction of every restaurateur and store and this and that. It's all, the economy of London comes out as an emergent property of lots of things. And it's the same with your personality. So no, there's no way for us to look and see something. And all of the ways of doing intervention now, including Elon Musk's cool technology, is only hitting a very tiny area, and it's only measuring from 1,000 neurons out of 86 billion neurons. And so no is the answer, for better or worse. We've
spent a lot of the last hour or so talking about the amazingness in some ways of the brain and also its complexity. We've also talked about some of its limitations. It's kind of extraordinary, isn't it, to reflect on the fact that we're able to, the reason that we have supremacy over other animals is because our brains are so sophisticated that we can develop tools that are stronger than we are to keep them at bay. So we can invent guns, for example. We can create computers that are smarter in certain ways than we are. And yet the world grinds to a halt during a pandemic because it takes us so long to achieve a vaccine, and we're not even certain yet that we'll ever get there. Does that kind of amaze you as well?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that this vaccine is the fastest one we've ever made, and it is actually amazing to watch 7.5 billion people all concentrating on one problem, because the scientific progress on this has been unmatched in history before. So that's the good news about it. the fact that we're all sort of stuck and, not knowing what to do and so on, just demonstrates that as a species, we are still very young. We're still not terribly sophisticated. We've made a lot of great gadgetry, like, the internet and so on. But we're still growing up. We're still in our infancy and learning how to best use these tools.
I love the fact that you were able to trick me into thinking that really was your living room.
Yes, that's one of the tools I use, is the virtual background on Zoom.
It's been really interesting spending the last hour or so with you. Thank you so much for your time. Your book, of course, Livewired, is available. There's loads more in that. We just touched the surface. Thank you very much, David. Thank you to everyone as well for tuning in, dialing in from right around the world. We've got loads more events with the How To Academy, including I'll be interviewing Sir Ronald Cohen tomorrow, and then the former England rugby captain, Dylan Hartley, on Thursday. But we've got a really exciting events autumn schedule ahead. So thank you to everybody involved. Do stay loyal to the How To Academy. It's such an important way of sharing ideas during this challenging time. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and stay well.